Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. I loved how that was just left with Mike about putting open source at the center of the agenda, and that's really what we're going to try and do here. What would be great is if you have any comments, please forgive me as a process point if I miss them, or if you've got any great questions, if you could please pop the bold question before your question, I'll be able to see it more easily and hopefully be able to bring it into the panel. As Paula just said, we are here right now to think a little bit beyond the code and think about the other aspects of open that can come right at the center of that open source agenda, specifically to look at the climate crisis. We're going to cover everything from the governance to the culture, philosophies, practice, process. And we have got a great panel of people here for you today. All of these people are working at the forefront of the intersection of technology and environment and trying to work out better ways for us to move forward. So I'm actually going to allow everybody, if that's all right, to introduce themselves and where they are in the world and what they care about, what they're working on before going into a discussion. Just going around my screen. Mark, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you, Helen, and thanks to OFE for inviting me and for being part of this great summit and this super interesting panel and discussion. So my name is Mark Verstappen. I'm the Deputy Head of Unit in DG Energy in the European Commission, the unit that's responsible for research, innovation, digitalization, and competitiveness. At the moment, I personally am very busy preparing a digitalization of energy action plan. So to make sure that we guide and push the investments in digitalization, in energy, in data exchange, for example, for the benefit of the energy transition. And in there, we see open source as playing a key role from experience and also for the future.
Thank you, Mark. Shuli?
Thank you so much. I really appreciated what Mike said and the way that he framed things, and I really appreciate being on this panel. I'm speaking to you from California, so I'm +9 for a lot of you, and the sun is just starting to rise. I think I'm the executive director and founder of LF Energy, and I went to the Linux Foundation about 5 years ago thinking, oh, this is a no-brainer. Open source and energy, we have monopolies, we need to go fast, we need to be able to innovate, we need to be able to transform the paradigm. And what I discovered is that it actually has been a really slow journey. It has. We have gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And what I see is that we're on the precipice of really expanding the understanding that leverage development and open source has an opportunity for being able to collaborate and cooperate across countries, across nations. The Linux Foundation is a global organization. LF Energy was really founded in Europe. Our first kind of like hello world came from RTE, the French transmission system operator. And from that, we have just expanded. We have now 50 members and are really looking at how to align utilities, corporates with net zero and vendors, and the new carbon tracking companies. And all of those, I think, really need to lie on top of an open source throughway. It's like the plumbing. It's our Silk Road to the future. So that's how I see it. And I'm really happy to be on this panel with Rashik, Amanda, and Mark. Thank you.
I love the idea of a throughway as opposed to a freeway. Amanda.
Thanks, Helen, and thank you to OFE for having me along today. I'm the CEO at Open UK, and I suspect for those of us sitting in the UK, in my case, I'm sitting in London, that we've probably seen more of what Mike's talking about than almost anybody in Europe with geopolitical shift. 2 years ago, I was speaking at this conference face-to-face in Brussels, And it was actually the last day that we were part of the European Union. So it was quite an emotional day, I think, for all of us Brits. And we've seen a rapid change in the last 2 years, and not just on climate action, but on sustainability in a bigger picture. And I think, again, specific to the UK, as the host of COP26 last year, we've really been focused on it. And that's led for us at Open UK to bring on board a chief sustainability officer about a year ago. We created a sustainability policy, which was shared Creative Commons and available to any organisations that would like to reuse that. And we started work on a project for COP26, which, funnily enough, is now hosted by the Eclipse Foundation. It's named Patchwork Kilt, and it's a blueprint for a data center of the future using open source software, hardware, and data to reduce carbon emissions. Yeah, we miss Europe too, Manfred. Just
Very much.
looking at the chat. So we took that to COP26. We hosted an event, actually a couple of hundred people face to face, which was quite incredible. It was great to bring community together. And with, I see Jim in the chat as well from Red Hat, who sponsored that event. And it was wonderful because we were able to start to look seriously about how open technology impacts sustainability. And I get into trouble for saying that it is inevitable that technology has to be open to be sustainable, because apparently I'm underselling it. And that what we really need to be doing is elevating the position of open technology in the sustainability agenda. And for us, that's software, hardware, and data.
Thanks, Amanda. Rashik?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. It's great to meet Mark, Shuli, and Amanda. And kind of building on off what Amanda was saying, I'm Rashid Palmer, an IBM Fellow and VP for Technology. And my focus has been really progressing the role of technology, its broadest sense, in helping both inform and enable the journey towards sustainability for businesses. And of course, open source at the heart of that. And to that end, what I've built out is a framework which we refer to as the Responsible Computing Framework. And that describes the best practices of what's a responsible data center look like, what's responsible infrastructure look like in that data center, what does responsible code look like on that infrastructure, what does responsible data look like there, and then as you build up from there to the notion of a responsible system overall, and then looking at responsible impacts. How do we use technology to address some of those systemic issues that help us become more sustainable? And that's creating tremendous traction. So if any of the listeners want to know more, then happy to discuss that. But that's my focus. How do we use computing as its way to become more responsible and use that in its broadest context to help create the sustainable world we all want?
Thank you. So I've obviously had the privilege of meeting you all, some more briefly than others before. And what has been interesting just listening to this introduction is there's this two sides of a coin that have been mentioned. I mean, Mark, you mentioned a piece of competitiveness within some of the work you're doing and how open applies that. And then Shuli, you spoke about collaboration, Amanda, you spoke about community. And so there's these dual aspects to open here. And I would really like to understand from your perspective, what are the challenges within that? How is that? Is it about competition? Is it about collaboration? Are the two able to work together? And how can we really advance a green agenda with those two potentially competing aspects on the table?
I'm happy to jump in if that's...
that would be great.
Yeah. So there's a term that Keith Bergal at OAN taught me, which is Coopetation. And I'm sure everybody sitting here knows that one. And I have to say that over a decade ago, when I first got involved in open source at Canonical, it was something that I was on a steep learning curve with and about, because what you have is these states where you are absolutely competing and at the same time collaborating with your competitors. And that's something I think the open source movement understands better than anybody in the world. But if the sustainability movement, if the green movement, the climate change movement really want to accelerate what they're doing and do it well, they need to learn from the good and the bad that we've all experienced through open source and that co-opetition.
And if I can build off what Amanda was saying, I completely agree with you. I think that there's so much good work going on in pockets.
Right.
part of the role of open source is to be able to bring that and make that available to everybody. So really allow us all to stand on the shoulders of giants. The whole sustainability story is not, or the situation is not a nice to have. It's an existential crisis for mankind. And we can't afford to wait for that, right? So we can't afford to just let it pass us by and be a bystander. We have to be an upstander. And that means that everybody's got to build on the excellent material and insights that we've already got. And that's part of the reason that I'm so keen to champion the responsible computing in a very open context, so that we can all contribute to it. Because I don't think anybody's got all the right answers. Everybody's got a piece of the story. And if we can all bring our pieces together, then we can create the fabric that can help us become much more sustainable.
Mark.
Yeah. If I can comment on this, I think this is a very good question. And maybe from sharing a bit of the experience from what I've seen in the work that we do, because one of the things that we do is support research and innovation through Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. So the big funding program of the EU to support research innovation in any dimension, basic research, applied research. Where we are particularly involved is in research for energy technologies and also the system innovation. And what we've seen and what is always a source of concern, I think, for a public funder is when we spend money on research and innovation, how fast is that going to the market? And in particular, if we're talking about the Green Deal and achieving climate neutrality, fast market uptake is super important. And in particular, in the systemic innovation type of projects that we're financing a lot, the typical smart grid type of projects, we see that very often these projects, unfortunately, when they are over, they also the infrastructure that has been built, the platform, for example, that has been built to allow demand response or enable smart charging of electric cars, or make sure that TSOs and DSOs, so network operators, transmission and distribution level, interact with consumers in terms of valorizing flexibility that they may have that helps to integrate renewables into the grid, that these things stop when the project is over, because there is regulatory framework is not conducive, there is no real market case for it, and very often those projects do not have enough market impact that we would like to see. And we've seen two very good examples recently of projects. I can think of one called Sonio, one that's now working called Platone, that are very good projects that have used open source as a starting point. And that has been a very good way of making sure that they create a market impact and making sure that they continue beyond the lifetime of the project, that they're taking up by further projects to be further developed. So standing on the shoulders of giants, as Rashik was also saying. So very practically, we've seen the benefits of open source in promoting innovation and making sure that it allows innovation to progress faster and to lead to market uptake much more than in some of the traditional approaches. And I think the examples come from a reason. It's for a reason that they come from those smart grid projects, from those systemic innovation type of projects. Because if we look at the energy transition and the Green Deal, carbon neutrality we're aiming for, it is very much a systemic change that we need. And even just looking at the electricity system on its own, decentralization, decarbonization, increased electrification, they are a lot of changes in the way that system is working. And the old way of just calling a coal-fired power plant or a gas-fired power plant to switch on and off, they're going to be gone. And we need to end them as quickly as possible if we want to be carbon neutral. But that requires that so many different parties need to align the way they act. And a network operator on its own won't be able to do anything if the car manufacturers don't give access to the data to allow smart charging, which helps the consumer to make sure that his car is charged when he wants to, which helps the energy producers to get rid, to feed the renewables into the system and make sure that it has a value. So a lot of different parties need to work together in innovating and making that system change. And their open source systems and open source way of collaboration are the best way to bring these people along and to allow people to jump in later, to get out, to do something competitive, jump in back again. And so we really see that as something that is very much fits with the systemic innovation and changes that we need.
So it's interesting what you're highlighting here is that, the real opportunity for open source within this world, and the opportunity for it to make a huge difference. Just a tiny step back, the green transition, the idea is essentially we want to have no net emissions by 2050, and we want to decouple economic growth from resources. And obviously there's a lot more within that, but there's a two big pillars of it. Shuli, I would love to know your thoughts on whether this transition and our ability to succeed within this transition is fundamentally an economic one or a political one.
Well,
or are they?
I don't know. I don't know that I would decouple them. I mean, there's in environments, I mean, particularly in the United States, there's so much money in politics, and I think that it's made it very, very complicated. Our political system is quite different than the European political system. It is economic, and that was really my takeaway from COP26, that the scientists have spoken, the politicians have tried, and now it becomes really incumbent upon business to decarbonize. And in some ways, every company on the planet has to become an energy company. We have to really consider sort of how we use electrons and how we contribute to electrons, and to fundamentally shift how we are consuming electricity so that we take on a much more kind of radical electron efficiency. What I hear when I'm listening to you guys, and and kind of wanting to build on, is that there's a fundamental paradigm shift. In the past, the way the critical infrastructure protected the security, life and limb, and the security of their economies is that they were really rewarded for stability. And that because energy on some level is all local, it's like you produce an electron, and that electron is very present in a physical space. And we've learned to move electrons over distances, but really energy is local. And so you have 8,000 utilities on the planet, and every single one of them is configured differently. And most of the software and the hardware has been really big, what we call in the States rate cases, in which somebody is given, $150 million or 150 million euros to go do something. But that this notion of kind of much more of a microservices architecture, something that is much more decomposed, like the way cloud computing, the way telecommunications, the way finance is working, the way healthcare is working. It's less this vision of these centralized monolithic platforms, and more a notion of really rapidly building and figuring out, how do we onboard renewables, what is required to do that, and is it a markets issue, is it a getting a data from the edge into the control room issue, is it a resource talent issue of having people working in utilities who are shifting from a utility mindset to actually a network operator mindset. And in the context of a network operator, what you're doing is you are the thing that is enabling massive communication between many different systems, and that's a journey, and it's really it's almost like the Silk Road to the future. It's the path we have to take, and we need to make it as frictionless as possible for companies to get on, so that they can decarbonize. And if decarbonization becomes a competitive issue, I think that that's really problematic, because if you have one company in a sector that is decarbonizing and another one that is not, but your customers suffer, then everybody loses. So this really is kind of like the great opportunity to shift paradigms.
Helen, can I jump in there? Just when you're
Absolutely,
asking
Amanda.
that political question. So I spent a considerable part of last year on an advisory board to the UK's Energy Digitalisation Task Force, and I've put a little bit in the chat on the launch of their report in January and a link to the report. And the report really takes this conversation, picking up on what Shuli said, back to open source. So you
Right.
see that it calls for open data, but for the first time it calls for open source first. And it doesn't just call for it, it says that this needs to be built on a digital spine that is open source. And it talks for that critical infrastructure for the UK. We've had similar in healthcare too, asking that this be built on open source because that's what's needed. Now, what that does is, again, it shifts the role of open source, which we've always considered to be in the commons, into the public sector, into the public good. When you're at a stage of digitalization where your national infrastructure isn't just roads and bridges, it's digital and it's open source, that's when you get to the point, surely, I think, where you have this conversation about security. And we know it might reference that it's been going on in the White House. And we start to call on government in a global joined up way to look to fund the long-term maintenance of the open source code that is forming that national and international digital infrastructure. And we're at a critical point in time where open source is an inevitability, and we really have to start to address that.
Does it specifically address why it needs an open source spine, and does that narrative transcend just the report out into the public, and is that important?
I think it does, and it addresses it for a number of reasons, one of which is interoperability and creating an environment where there isn't lock-in and where you're able to build infrastructure with open APIs that allow competition, that allow users to choose to move in a realistic way, that allows competitors to come into the marketplace, but also allows the best technology. And I think we're all, especially this audience, we're all agreed that that's what it's going to create. But how do we do it? We need that political engagement. We need governments on board, and we need to see this shift in funding.
So that question of how do we do it, I was very, I was going to say fortunate. I was unfortunate that my car died about a week ago. And I replaced my car with a lovely secondhand tiny electric car. And what fascinated me was I was the same person that hopped from one to the other, yet the incentives within the design of the car itself, one incentivized you for performance in terms of driving fast and speeding along and all of the wonderful comfort and joy that gives you. This tiny little secondhand electric car incentivizes you to conserve the battery. It gives you data on what you're doing. And same person, drove entirely different, based upon the incentive structures that were designed into the very material I was sitting in. It was still a tin box taking me from A to B. And I'd love to know about how we get people on board, how we get governance. What are the incentive structures that we can design and that you have seen work? Rashik, you spoke about the responsible. I love the word responsible. I think sustainability sometimes has been overdone and people don't hear it as much. What are the incentives that we can design into systems to make people behave differently?
Yeah, and so from the work that we've done so far, the people designing and building the systems would love to do that. And unfortunately, they get encumbered with unrealistic timescales, limited budgets, a whole bunch of constraints, which means that they try and do the best they can. Right. Once you take an organization, as part of responsible computing, we talk about a kind of manifesto for responsible computing. What do we actually value? Right? We value doing things which decarbonize, that reduce environmental impact, right, in its broadest sense. And by doing that, you get a kind of bottom-up transformation that starts to take place. And some of the work that we've done, one very simple example, just from an IT perspective, we took the same system and the team came back and said, by the way, we just ran out of time, but if we'd had a bit more time, we'd have tested a slightly different infrastructure. We could have reduced the environmental footprint. And we gave them a bit of space. They went and did that. They reduced the environmental footprint by over 60% in a matter of a few weeks. And another example was just on the data side. Some of the teams were saying, we maintain multiple copies of the same data because just in case we need it. Right? to the point where the organization had over 100 copies of a very large data set when they only needed 3 or 4 copies, right? And that amount of waste is just there because you can, and it's almost hidden. You don't really understand from an IT perspective whether it's a half a gigabyte or 2 terabytes. It just looks like nothing because you don't actually see it. But that has an impact on energy, on resources, and we don't see it. Right? And part of the whole approach of responsible computing is to say, how do you expose that? So as you're saying in your car, if you can see that the amount of energy consuming, and it encourages you to do the right things, be more responsible in how you drive, all of a sudden you start to change your behaviors. So part of this is actually surfacing it and finding the ways of exposing the information in a practical and actionable way for the consumer and the developer. So it's a whole life cycle needs to think through this.
And please carry on, Julie.
I totally agree. One of the projects that we're just starting up is what we call super advanced meter, SAM, because I think the answer to the question is that people behind the meter need to have information about what it is that they're doing. And and this design is being driven by the Netherlands, who are going to replace all of their meters and wanting to do an open hardware, open design reference architecture with a reference software implementation on top that will be universal for both North America and for Europe. And the reason why it's so important is that once we open up that gateway into some kind of a energy management system that sits behind the building, and we also clearly articulate what carbon is in the system, the carbon intensity of electrons and the time of use and all those things that are going to change over the next 20 years. Then behind we can start building platforms and software and operating systems that sit on top of that. So that your basic average person knows what is their carbon footprint, or the commercial entity can understand, oh, if we run our operations at this time, it's going to be this, or at some other time. So there is not, we just used petrol. We just used electrons. We didn't really think about them. And, the shift in the paradigm is that we need enough feedback in the system so that we can begin changing ourselves.
Can I add one more thing, Helen?
Of course.
Yeah, one of the projects that we've worked on that is fairly well known in open source is our kids competition and our kids camp. We did a course for that in 2021, openuk.uk/openkidscamp, and there were 10 lessons, each of which is focused on the open source definition and the sustainable development goals and how those two align. And I mention it because it is Creative Commons, and everybody who's on this call and beyond is very welcome to take and reuse it. But there needs to be a sort of grassroots level shift and learning around sustainability, I think, not just looking at, with all respect, having something new in your car that helps you behave better. I had a smart meter which did the same to me. I was running around switching things off, but which is great, but that's only one little shift. We need a much bigger change.
And that's a really important point. I think that the altitudes of these conversations, they can shift. And I think that we need to look at, as you say, the grassroots piece, what I can do as an individual. Shuli, you mentioned earlier that, the scientists have told us the governments aren't doing it. It's down to business. There's a role for everyone within this. Mark, I would be interested in hearing from you on this specifically. Sort of what is the leadership that the European Commission is bringing to this in terms of the incentives and narratives piece, but also in terms of that the data and feedback. I think you Shuli put it brilliantly as where's the feedback within the system?
Yeah. Yes. No, I think that's a very good question, and. Of course, this, I can talk about many things here in terms of what we're doing and also at many different levels. But maybe I take, let's say, one general example and one very specific issue. I think one general example, if I think in terms of the leadership, I see one way where I think in the EU, where the Green Deal is making an impact, and the way this is working in Europe, just through the way administrations work, is the fact that this the Green Deal now is not just an energy or a transport or climate change challenge. We are, for better or for worse, we had a whole discussion on the taxonomy of how to promote financing. That came from our colleagues who are actually normally dealing with, are dealing with the banks, with the financial system. We're talking about the recovery program to get out of the COVID crisis, which brings a lot of DGs together in trying to identify what are the key priorities to make the Green Deal happen. We're talking with the energy intensive industry, not just from the point of view of be energy efficient, but what is the future in terms of where do your resources come from? How can they be sustainable? What is the role of energy in there? What is the, where are the innovations that bring those things together? So it's a much wider discussion now than it was 5 years ago. And I think I see that the way it's discussed within the Commission, but I think that's also happening within the member states. I think all over the world, basically. The same thing in Glasgow. It's not just and I think it's the same for companies. It's not a department in a company anymore. Like Shuli said, every company is becoming an energy company in one way or the other, because they have to worry about this much more than just to say, where do we buy our energy? It's about what is your view on society and the role you want to play and how you position yourself in contributing to the greenhouse gas emission reduction. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing, maybe very specific, if you talk about creating the incentives and getting consumers on board, I think there is a matter of regulation, of policy, and of incentivizing people. If we talk about integrating renewables into the system, it is when the wind blows or the sun shines that the electricity is produced. So we need to adapt the consumption more to when the electricity is there. And this requires rewarding flexibility. At the future, the value in the electricity system in the future is not in an electron, it's in the flexibility and the ability for the demand to follow the supply. But that only works for consumers and can only work for consumers to adapt their behavior if there are market signals. So we have been working with network operators to say the way that this used to work, where you would ask a year in advance which gas-powered power plants can make 100 megawatt available for the next year on call when we need it, into ask this a week in advance, don't ask for 100 megawatt, but ask for a megawatt, and allow it to be scaled up or scaled down. So, and make those offers separate. So batteries can participate in that market, solar panels can participate in that market. We're not there yet. This is ongoing work. It's not done yet, but I think this is also where we're showing leadership in Europe of how this market should evolve, and where we're, on the other hand, then promoting innovators through also digitalization, making the data that come out of all these different parts of the system available to offer services to consumers that makes it very easy to grasp the value that comes with such flexibility.
Thank you, Mark.
There was something.
Shuli, please.
There's something that Mark said that I think is really important, which is governments fund kind of R&D and innovation, and you've done great with Soigno, with Platone, with others, and North America is doing it, and Asia. Everybody is kind of like putting money in to try and stimulate innovation. But then there's I guess they call it the valley of death in between R&D and commercialization. And I think that there's a role, not just for open source, but for open source foundations in being able to walk that R&D forward into an environment that is commercialized. And I would say that my biggest frustration is trying to figure out who is responsible for helping get across that valley of death. And how can we actually encourage innovation, like real or adoption right from the get-go? In other words, what I mean by that is that in the design of the project, the commercialization aspects of it and how to engage stakeholders that are going to build commercial dependencies is actually part of the process, and that there is an assumption that there's going to need to be funding to get it over and commercialized. And because of the amount of money that's being spent and because of how fast we need to move, that particular nested area, of taking that open source and making it become kind of the commercial future, it really needs to be attended to. And I don't know if you have any ideas about it, Mark, Amanda, and Rashik and Helen, but that's where I think the problem is right now, or one of the problems. Because I think once we get it into the foundation, there's a pathway, but there's something in between that helps it actually move forward.
I'm happy to jump in a little bit on that. And I think one of the issues there surely is that not everything can go into a foundation. So there's, for every project that's in LF, I'm sure there's 1,000 that would like to be there. And some of those projects, when we look at Log4j, something that we would never have identified as one of the main projects needing funded is absolutely critical because of its ubiquity. And in a way, we need to capture and nurture everything that we're seeing on the open repos, whether it's GitHub, GitLab, that's getting this mass and ubiquitous adoption. And that's the difficulty. And that's where we need to look, I think, at a couple of different ways of generating the funds to ensure that it's safe and secure going forwards, and which will create more trust, not just through transparency, which open obviously brings, but trust through it being secure. And I think for that to work, we need a combination of the commercialization that we've talked about, the foundations, and also this government funding. And that really needs to be joined up.
Totally agree.
And what are some of the other things? Sorry, Rashik, were you going to come in on that point specifically?
Yeah, I'm just going to build on what Amanda was saying, because I think the point here is that that there is a responsibility of anybody that's consuming open source. And that responsibility is both understanding the dependency, but also contributing to that as well, right? If the community only works if there's a balance, right? And if we are just extracting and not giving back, then that starts to dry up. So you've got to think about that ecosystem and making sure that you are supporting the ecosystem in a much more responsible way. That's part of the kind of thinking that we've got in the responsible computing framework.
And what are some of the other challenges? I know there's, sorry, I can't read it all, some comments in the chat about, burdens on software developers, and this is, this is all on the community. What are the other, we've spoken about funding from government, and what are the other pieces of this? We know that, I'm going to make a gross generalization, but I feel my audience is okay with it. We know open is better. We know open creates more innovation. It is faster. It's more sustainable. But what are the things that we need to do to actually work smarter to allow this green transition to take root?
So if I can kick off on that, and I talked about some of the burdens, I think, or the issues that we see in our projects. So we've had a number of projects in this space. And consistently, the challenges that we face, first of all, is we don't really have a usable baseline of data we can work from. And we start to spend so much time arguing on the actual numbers that we don't spend enough time actually doing the work. And so establishing that kind of baseline of data to say, where are we at today in the sustainability or responsible part of this framework, software, business element, etc. Second one is there's this kind of almost element of greenwashing and saying, oh, right, I've done it, I've greenwashed it, right? You don't actually understand the dependencies and the underlying implications of this, right? And so you think you've made some progress, but actually you on balance, you probably haven't. In fact, you may have actually got worse. Although this part might be greener, the rest of it may be worse. And that part of it, I think, is a big burden or a big issue that we've got to kind of think through. The third one is most enterprises, to try and get the move to any of these things, it takes a lot of interventions, right? That organizational inertia of this is the way we do this. We don't have time to do it any other way. is actually a massive, massive issue. And how we overcome those, what I think are the three main barriers that we face, I think is something that we'd love to get some more insight on. I don't think we've got all the answers, but they're certainly the ones that we see consistently.
Helen, I think I would add to that there was some comments earlier in the chat about metrics and what we're measuring. And for our year 2 sustainability strategy, which will lead to our second Open Technology for Sustainability Day, or in fact, it'll be a couple of days in October, what Open UK is taking on is looking at metrics. And we're going to be building metrics that measure open technologies against sustainability. We'll start with the SDGs. Whether we end up there, I don't know. But that will also allow us to create benchmarking. And that's going to be absolutely critical as this progresses. So knowing what it is that we're measuring and measuring the right things.
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes left of the session. I feel like I could talk to you all for a long, long time afterwards. But everybody, you've got 30 seconds. What is the one thing that you think this audience should know and you want them to leave with? I will give the floor to Mark first.
Right. Well, I think that the one thing to take away from this, and what I also take away from this, is that the Green Deal, achieving carbon neutrality, even the electricity system specifically, requires a systemic change. It requires cooperation where no individual party can make the transition happen. We need each other, and open source is a great way of organizing those interactions and making those changes happen.
Thank you. Shuli.
That the changes that face us are not just technical, they're social, they're economic. And because of that, we need platforms and communities where we can do that work. So it's not just that we need open source and create, new tools for markets. We also have to change the minds and the people and grow the talent. Frankly, I think that it's the power of together, and that's what we have to figure out, how to do that work and to keep our heads down and keep going. That's really been my approach. Is there's an enormous amount of noise in the system, and the closer we get to the kind of going off the climate cliff, the louder the noise is going to be. And we just have to keep our heads down and keep focused on creating the future.
Thanks, Shuli. Amanda?
I wanted to wrap up by saying thank you to OFE for bringing us together for this policy discussion. I think it's been a great discussion. My parting thought is really that tech is not the solution. It's a tool. And that tool is going to be much better if it's open and collaborative, and that we work on that together. And I really hope that we'll see that happen over the next year.
Thank you. Rashik?
Yeah, I'd just build on what Amanda said. Tech is not the answer. Tech is a tool. But I think we need to adopt the right kind of values and principles that help us, help guide the decisions in a way which helps us become more sustainable. And I think I would say, let's all become an upstander and actually try and make a difference rather than just being a bystander and letting it go past.
Thank you. I think the thing that I'm taking from this, if I may, is that I'm eternally grateful for the four of you being in this fight and in our corner to save the planet. So thank you very much for your thoughts and your engagement. Mark, Shuli, Amanda, Rashik, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to OFE Europe.